Good day, everyone. My name is Peter Kappers. I'm with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar on developing forecasts, where we're going to focus on distributed energy resources. My colleagues Margaret Pigman from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and Shabani Ghosh from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory will be presenting information today about, developing forecasts and DERs. So we can go to the next slide. First and foremost, we want to thank the Department of Energy for funding this effort. If it wasn't for their generosity, we wouldn't be able to provide this, as well as the rest of the series of webinars that are being presented on topics of load forecasting and resource adequacy. As you can see on the next slide, a number of these have already occurred in time. We kicked off our series back on October 14th, providing an overview of the series as a whole and really trying to provide connections between load forecasting and resource adequacy issues to state planning efforts. We then moved on to providing a general overview of forecasting methods, tips, techniques, best practices, then talked about developing forecasts specifically for load expansion. Today, we're talking about distributed energy resources. And that really closes the book on the forecast side of things. We then move into a series of resource adequacy webinars on the next slide. We held a basics one of those back on November 10th. We then did focus on the topic of transmission and distribution system planning, provided some basic information around that for folks. And then in early December, we will be focusing on the evolution of resource accreditation, a very important issue right now that is really evolving and is having some pretty serious implications for capacity opportunities for different types of resources. All of these webinars you can register for online. If you happen to have missed registration and not been able to attend them live, we are doing much like we're doing today, recording them for posterity so you can access at a later point in time. And so with those formalities out of the way, let's get to why you're here. Let me turn things over to Margaret to kick us off and talk about energy efficiency and demand flexibility. Margaret, you're on mute, just so you know.
Sorry, thank you. So thank you, Pete. In my next slide, please. In my presentation today, I'll start off by discussing two approaches to forecasting efficiency and demand flexibility for long-term electricity planning. And the first is the load modifier approach, where you use efficiency and demand flexibility as a decrement to the load forecast. The second is the competitive resource approach, where efficiency and flexibility are treated analogously to supply-side resources in capacity expansion models and IRP planning. After that, I'll identify some opportunities to improve the process of selecting the quantity and timing of efficiency and flexibility, and I'll wrap up with questions that state PUCs can ask. So first, a note about terminology. I'm going to use demand flexibility as an umbrella term to mean the ability to change a consumption pattern to meet various grid needs. For example, a time of use rate that incentivizes customers to consume during off-peak hours, or a direct load control program that allows the utility to curtail a particular load. When talking about an example from a particular utility, I'll use the term that they use. Next slide, please. So regardless of how a utility incorporates efficiency and flexibility into their forecast, they start with a potential assessment to provide information on the quantity of resources available, the timing of the resource availability, the cost, and the load or savings shape. The graphic on this slide is from the NIPSCO market potential study. They estimated technical, economic, maximum achievable, and realistically achievable potential. As defined in their study, technical potential is the theoretical maximum amount of energy use that could be displaced by efficiency. It is constrained by factors like technical feasibility and applicability of measures, but not by cost. And this is a pretty standard definition. Economic potential refers to the subset of the technical potential that is cost-effective as compared to conventional supply-side resources. The economic potential ignores market barriers, as does the technical potential. NIPSCO used the utility cost test to assess cost effectiveness. This is not a standard definition. Different jurisdictions have different definitions of cost effective. Achievable potential is the amount of energy that can be realistically saved, given various market barriers, such as financial constraints, customer awareness, and willingness to participate in programs. The study evaluated scenarios, the maximum achievable potential which estimates the potential, assuming NIPSCO pays incentives equal to 100% of measure incremental costs, and the realistically achievable potential, which assumes that incentive payments are close to the current levels offered by the utility. Next slide, please. Most utilities in the US use 6 steps to develop their resource potential, and the end product of the potential study is the resource forecast. First, utilities estimate the technical potential of a technology on a per unit basis. Here, when I say unit, it could mean a variety of things, such as a house, commercial floor space, or appliance counts. Next, they determine how much of the technical potential is economic, usually based on an avoided cost or cost effectiveness test, which is what NIPSCO did. To move from per unit to territory-wide, they then estimate the number of applicable units. For example, the number of air conditioners that will reach the end of their useful life and need to be replaced, or the floor area of new commercial construction that there will be. Combining the previous 2 steps gives the economic potential of all the applicable units. Next, estimate economically achievable potential to account for how you anticipate customers will adopt technologies. This can involve creating multiple scenarios to investigate a range of quantities of efficiency or flexibility. And then finally, deduct that quantity from the gross load forecast, and the result in the capacity expansion model is used to find the least cost portfolio of supply side resources to serve the forecast model or forecasted load. On the next slide, well, there's the second approach, which is to incorporate efficiency and flexibility into a forecast by treating them as competitive resources that a capacity expansion model can select. Specifically, in this case, the model assesses the economic viability of efficiency or demand flexibility at the same time that it considers supply-side resources. This allows for consideration of the relative cost and risk across the broadest possible array of potential resource solutions. Next slide, please. So using this approach still requires a potential study, but the cost comes into the process at a very different time. So the process still starts with determining the technical potential of the unit, but instead of considering cost at this point, it skips to estimating the number of applicable units and then the technical potential for all units. The next step reduces the technical potential based on how much of it is estimated to be that can be achieved. In the Pacific Northwest, for example, this is 85% of the technical potential identified over a 20-year period. Now, finally, cost comes into play in the next step, which takes the achievable potential and turns it into supply curves that compete with supply-side resources to meet the gross forecasted load. This means that the least cost portfolio that is found by the capacity expansion model will include efficiency and flexibility resources along with the supply-side ones. If there are specific requirements for a certain resource, then those are typically modeled as a must-build resource. For example, if your state has an energy efficiency resources standard, that quantity of efficiency doesn't have to compete with other resources. It is forced into the model as a resource. The same is true of flexibility. Next slide, please. So the primary difference between using efficiency as a selectable resource and using a potential study to identify the quantity of efficiency or flexibility that is available is that the economic potential is determined in the capacity expansion model with all other resources. So this requires creating efficiency supply curves. They are used to identify the quantity of the level of efficiency or demand flexibility that can be attained at, at various ranges of cost, which is what is shown in the graphic. They enable the economic comparison of efficiency and other generation investments. Because there are hundreds of possible efficiency and demand flexibility measures, individual measures are bundled together into groups that the model can select at a quantity that is large enough to make a difference in planning. There are a few different ways that they can be bundled. On the next slide is an example of an exploratory analysis from Georgia Power, where they were looking at different approaches for how to bundle the measures. They created commercial and residential bundles that are grouped based on similar load shapes on the left, similar value in the middle, and similar cost on the right. As with most things, the devil is in the details, and different approaches to creating efficiency bundles resulted in different quantities of the resource that is available for the model to select. For example, in their commercial analysis, when the bundles were created based on load shape, there was 6% more commercial efficiency available at a weighted average levelized cost of $20 per megawatt hour than when the bundling was done by value. Next slide, please. Another example is this demand response study supply curve from the Northwest Power and Conservation Council's 2021 plan. The chart shows the different measures on the horizontal axis and the net levelized cost of acquiring that bundle but on the y-axis. In this case, the bundles were determined by net levelized cost, with bin 1 being available at $2 per kilowatt year and bin 4 at 79. Next slide, please. So while considering efficiency and demand flexibility as selectable resources is an emerging trend, there are many utilities that are already considering it and beginning this type of analysis. I've been talking about the load modifier and competitive resource approaches as completely separate, but I want to note that some utilities are using a sort of hybrid approach. There's a cost-effectiveness screening in the potential study, and then the efficiency and demand flexibility resources are bundled to be selected in the IRP modeling. NIPSCO and Entergy New Orleans are examples of this approach. Next slide, please. Regardless of what approach is used, potential studies need to be performed well, and the data inputs must be robust. Four common shortcomings that I'll discuss in my next few slides are not accounting for interaction between efficiency, flexibility, and the other resources, between different types of efficiency and flexibility, using inaccurate load shapes, and not accounting for all financial benefits. The competitive resource approach can help with address the first two, but the last two are issues regardless of what approach is used. Next slide, please. So the first challenge is optimization between supply side and demand side resources, which can be addressed by competing efficiency and demand flexibility as selectable resources in the capacity expansion model. This chart shows the quantity of natural gas capacity that is developed under different levels of efficiency and demand response, again, as part of analysis done for the Northwest Power and Conservation Council's 7th Power Plan. The x-axis is year, and the y-axis is the megawatts of gas developed. The blue line shows how much efficiency is selected when its cost must be less than or equal to the long run avoided cost with demand response. If it results in the lowest quantity of gas capacity developed. The yellow line selects efficiency with a cost less than or equal to the short run market price with demand response and results in new gas capacity coming online in 2022. Finally, the red line selects efficiency with a cost less than or equal to the long run avoided cost without demand response. In this case, the gas capacity comes online in 2017. If utilities use their potential study to create their efficiency or flexibility forecast, then they won't be able to consider the impact of demand-side resources against each other or other supply-side resources. This is one advantage of allowing efficiency and demand response to be selected as resources. Another way potential studies can fall short is when they're optimization between demand-side resources. In this case, efficiency and demand flexibility. Allowing direct competition permits the optimization of all resources based on their cost, load shape, or load following characteristics, and risk. This results in a more robust analysis to identify a reliable low-cost system. This slide focuses on the interaction between efficiency and demand response, and it shows the outcome of analysis done for the Northwest Power and Conservation Council's 7th Power Plan. The x-axis is time and the y-axis is capacity developed. The dotted lines represent demand response capacity developed, and the solid lines represent energy efficiency capacity developed under different avoided costs. The orange lines use the long run avoided cost, and the blue lines use short run market prices. Using the short run price, less efficiency is selected and more demand response is selected. Using the long run price, more efficiency is selected and less demand response is selected. This shows the interaction between efficiency and demand response and how choosing one resource impacts the quantity of the other resource, as well as the impact of using long and short run pricing. Considering these resources together in the capacity expansion model allows planners to see the interaction between the two types of resources. Next slide, please. Another challenge with potential studies is accurate load shapes. This graph shows hour of the day on the horizontal axis and the maximum savings for the measure on the vertical axis. The orange line is an electric resistance water heating shape, and the blue line is a heat pump water heating shape, saving shapes. The takeaway here is that if you are planning or valuing your efficiency, assuming that the maximum savings occur at hour ending 10, your planners are going to be surprised when those savings show up at hour ending 7. Using the electric resistance water heating shape will undervalue the savings, and if the system peak is occurring earlier in the morning, perhaps on a winter day, may significantly undervalue the savings. The result may be an investment in more expensive resources unnecessarily. Next slide, please. This is another example using NREL's end-use load profiles and saving shapes that are publicly available. These are the consumption and savings shapes for residential electric heating in the state of Illinois, comparing electric resistance, which is blue, to a high-efficiency cold climate heat pump, which is orange. The gray shows the savings shape. They're all slightly different. In particular, the heat pump shape is more varied throughout the day than the other two, which would assign more savings in the morning and less in the afternoon than it should. This is the same point, namely that having accurate load shapes impacts the value and selection of resources to meet system needs. Next slide, please. The last example I provide on shortcomings of potential studies is not including all of the benefits when valuing efficiency and flexibility. Economic value of efficiency or flexibility or any resource is based on the cost of the next unit of energy that provides the same service. In this chart, the 4 bars represent the value of a unit of air conditioning savings in 4 parts of the country. On the far left is the Pacific Northwest, where the electricity system doesn't peak in the summer, which means that the air conditioning isn't worth that much to the system. On the far right is Georgia Power. Even though they have a summer peaking system that would imply that air conditioning should be valuable, it doesn't show up that way here. That's because their publicly available information does not include avoided transmission and distribution as value streams. This doesn't mean that those streams don't have value, it just means that they're not being counted. Not fully valuing efficiency or any DER may result in selecting more expensive resources. Next slide, please. In our last session, we talked about load forecasts, which are the foundation of resource planning. They predict both the amount and timing of electricity consumption and are used by planners as a basis for understanding future electricity needs and developing plans to meet the demand. Regardless of what approach is used, load modification or competitive resources, it is important to have consistency between the load forecast and your potential assessment so that you don't under or overestimate the resources. Some specific inputs are baseline consumption should be about equivalent in the load forecast and the resource potential assessment. You should start from the same point. The number of units should be the same. Emerging issues such as electrification amplify this point. If you replace an electric heater with a heat pump, the savings will show up in your potential study. If you replace a gas heater with a heat pump, it might not show up in your load forecast or in your potential study, or neither. It is important to understand what resources are included in which analyses and use consistent inputs. Next slide, please. This is an example, again from NIPSCO. In their load forecast, they consider 2 electrification scenarios, which would change the quantity of efficiency that's available. However, their potential study does not include analogous electrification scenarios and only reports achievable potential for the baseline case. Here I'm showing one of the electrification scenarios on the right and the single efficiency potential estimates on the left. The next example is on the next slide, is from Unitil in Massachusetts. Their potential study included the impact of fuel switching and efficient electric heating under different adoption scenarios. So the quantity of potential electric savings increased as electrification increased. Specifically, this slide is highlighting some of their efficiency measures that are only present if there's electrification. On the next slide, these are some questions that states can consider as they are digging into their efficiency and flexibility inputs and that are shown here. I've been talking specifically about efficiency and demand flexibility, but really it applies to any assets the utility doesn't own, like distributed solar and batteries. The next slide just shows resources for more information. So that is the end of my section, and I would like to pass it to Shabani for her section.
Thank you, Margaret. Hello, everyone. I'm Shibani Ghosh, and I'll be discussing distributed solar and battery storage for the second part of this study. Over the past decade, distributed energy sources, particularly solar PV and battery energy storage systems, have seen significant growth in adoption and technological advancements. we are looking into these resources and how they are transforming the energy landscape by increasing customer independence and enhancing grid resilience. In this hub, I'll cover three main topics related to distributed solar and battery storage. First, I will briefly discuss the pace and scale of adoption trends over time, including how changing consumer behaviors, declining costs, and incentives have impacted adoption rates. Second, we'll look at the forecasting trends for solar and storage, with an emphasis on how utilities predict future development and impacts. Lastly, we'll discuss some real-world case studies, including a collaborative effort, such as the one with California Energy Commission and NREL, which provides insights into effective policy design and market mechanisms and solutions. This context hopefully helps frame how distributed solar and storage contribute to the overall shift towards clean energy systems. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So in the past, what we've seen is the grid used to operate with mostly a unidirectional flow of energy or electrons all the way from generating units to consumers through a delivery network, such as transmission and distribution systems. Next slide, please. But with distributed energy resources, we are seeing how the previous slide, please. We are seeing how that unidirectional flow is changing into a more dynamic, decentralized system where energy can flow both to and from customers. And this shift is creating new opportunities and challenges for utilities. Levers like rooftop solar and battery energy storage not only help meet local energy needs, but can also provide grid services such as peak shaving or voltage regulation. Next slide, please. With a paired battery storage system with distributed solar offers several compelling benefits. First, batteries can store that excess solar energy generated during the day and dispatch when the demand peaks, or when solar generation drops, effectively flattening the load curve. This can enhance the grid resilience by providing backup power during outages. Conversely, these systems also face challenges, including high upfront capital costs for batteries and ongoing operations and maintenance expenses. Next slide, please. On the other hand, distributed solar brings myriad advantages to the energy landscape. For customers, rooftop solar provides the ability to reduce energy bills and ensuring power availability even during planned or unplanned disruptions. On a larger scale, it contributes to grid stability by reducing demand during peak hours. To add to that, distributed solar has significant local economic impacts, promoting job creation in installation, maintenance, and related services. It also empowers consumer choice, enabling households and businesses to actively participate in the energy transition. Next slide, please. While distributed solar and battery storage offer significant benefits, there are several challenges to widespread deployment. Some of these are tied to resource limitations, factors such as suitable rooftops and land use constraints, which can hinder adoption in certain regions. Secondly, there's the challenge of state and utility variability in interconnection policies, permitting requirements, and rate structure. Additionally, increasing penetration of these resources require improved grid integration strategies, including advanced monitoring and forecasting tools to balance supply and demand. Next slide, please. Despite these challenges, distributed solar has seen steady growth over the last 2 decades. This slide shows some data-backed evidence of this growth, which has been developed by our colleagues at LPNL. The residential systems, as seen in the slide, have been growing in size, and as of last year, the median size was 7.2 kilowatts. Non-residential systems, however, can vary widely, but the sizing distribution remains fairly stable since 2014. Next slide, please. Now, this slide takes a deeper look into the state-level adoption of distributed solar for the last year. The residential system's size roughly ranged from 4 to 11 kilowatts, while the non-residential systems had a wider range with long upper tails. It's also important to note that the non-residential PV market can vary considerably from one state to another. Next slide, please. Like distributed solar, BESS sizes has also they had also seen growths in their installed sizing, and as of last year, the median kilowatt hour was 13.5 for residential systems. That's the size of a single Powerwall. Across all segments, though, the prevalent size of battery energy storage was 2 hours, but large non-residential systems had at least 20% of paired systems having 4+ hours of storage. Also, it's important to note that for smaller systems, we see that the storage kilowatt capacity was roughly equal to the paired PV kilowatt capacity. Next slide, please. This slide shows the growth trends in paired PV plus storage systems. The residential market had been trending towards an increasing battery kilowatt capacity since 2021. On the other hand, the non-residential market have been steadily progressing towards smaller system size, both in kilowatt hour and kilowatt capacity. Next slide, please. This is the last slide in this understanding of current trends and evolution of PV plus storage systems. And I wanted to highlight how the installed costs for PV plus storage systems have steadily decreased over time. And that makes these systems more financially accessible to consumers and businesses alike. Residential systems, as we can see in this slide, generally have higher upfront costs compared to non-residential projects. However, both the segments are following a clear downward price trajectory supported by technical improvements, manufacturing efficiencies, and policy initiatives like tax incentives. Next slide, please. So this next section, I'll be talking about how utilities and stakeholders address the forecasting problem for distributed solar and storage. Next slide, please. This slide shows different types of forecasting horizons for PV systems that are essential for ensuring grid-stability and reliable planning. These horizons can range from nowcasting, which predicts solar energy output typically within the next 6 hours, and they use satellite data and machine learning methodologies. These nowcasting applications are utilized for real-time balancing to short-term forecasts, which usually cover the range from 6 to 48 hours, supporting day-ahead market scheduling using numerical weather models. For medium-term forecasting, planners rely on ensemble forecasts spanning 2 to 7 days for operations like unit commitment. Finally, long-term forecasts using climate models and historical seasonal patterns cover weeks to months ahead, providing crucial planning data for the utilities, resource maintenance, and strategic planning. In the next few slides, I'll discuss how utilities address solar forecasting in their planning and operation practices. Slide, please. This slide shows the example of an electric utility, Southern California Edison, to provide some utility-specific context into this forecasting methodology. So SC projects the need for over 100 gigawatts of new solar capacity by 2045, with nearly half of that being behind installations. And that will contribute to around 50 terawatt hour per year. However, they acknowledge that inaccurate forecasting can be costly. It can lead to reliability issues, canceled maintenance operations, and higher energy procurement costs. This underscores the importance of advanced forecasting methodologies, real-time updates, and proactive planning. Next slide, please. The next slide shows the example of a electric utility, Southern California Edison, to provide some utility-specific context into this forecasting methodology. So SC projects the need for over 100 gigawatts of new solar capacity by 2045, with nearly half of that being behind installations. And that will contribute to around 50 terawatt hour per year. However, they acknowledge that inaccurate forecasting can be costly. It can lead to reliability issues, canceled maintenance operations, and higher energy procurement costs. This underscores the importance of advanced forecasting methodologies, real-time updates, and proactive planning. This slide shows the timeline for SCE's management system. Short form is GMS, which is a cornerstone of their approach to solar forecasting and ensuring system reliability. As they've seen solar capacity growing rapidly, tools like GMS play a vital role in balancing generation and load across distribution and transmission networks. SCE uses this system to integrate real-time data and short-term forecasting insights, enabling grid operators to monitor and adjust for fluctuations in solar outputs effectively. This approach helps address key challenges associated with renewable energy sources such as solar in terms of grid stability and operational efficiency. SCE's investment in advanced forecasting tools like GMS demonstrate how utilities can leverage technology to optimize solar integration, reduce costs, and enhance overall grid performance. Next slide, please. SCE uses something called short-term forecasting engine, STFE, to manage real-time generation data for monitored PV systems and grid conditions. For unmonitored systems, STFE assumes bellwether methods to forecast productions for those systems. However, STFE currently does not forecast BESS behavior, but it needs to account for it when training its load modeling algorithm, and applying it to forecast load. Notably, it is particularly difficult to predict BESS that are 1, customer-owned and controlled, and 2, available as reserve capacity and may dispatch on short notice, and 3, used for frequency control to manage fast load and generation variations. Next slide, please. So moving on from the utility-specific context, this slide wanted to highlight some critical policy implications and themes surrounding distributed solar and storage systems. These are vital as we continue advancing energy transformations with these assets. Regulatory objectives can play a key role in ensuring equity, efficiency, and sustainability within these transitions. Technical aspects such as net metering configurations and reasonable interconnection timelines need to be designed thoughtfully to minimize project costs and delays. Additionally, rate design components and valuations of benefits are essential for driving adoption while balancing utility cost recovery. By addressing local construction permitting standards and ensuring streamlined processes, we can foster innovation and accelerate deployment across diverse communities. Next slide, please. This slide takes a deeper look into what type of key technical characteristics we need to keep in mind as far as battery energy storage systems go. The rated kilowatt and energy capacity in kilowatt hour are usually the most common ones, but there are other components like lifetime and efficiency parameters, which are also useful to keep in mind for planners who are considering higher adoption. Next slide, please. And this slide shows different timescale and applications of storage systems. For example, PTM applications mostly focus on power quality and demand charge management, whereas the larger scale ones, such as distribution scale ones, can be used for voltage support and upgrade deferred projects. Next slide, please. So this slide looks into one available tool. This is an example of what's out there that I would like to give a quick overview of. So this is called a Distributed Generation Market Demand Tool, DGen, developed by NREL. This has been a flagship NREL tool that has incorporated detailed spatial data. And this figure on the left that shows examples of resource potential under a nationwide study done in 2021. Next slide, please. So this slide highlights the methodology used in forecasting adoption. It breaks down into technical, economic, and market categories. It starts all the way from technical potential, which is the highest, and represents the maximum technically feasible capacity for PV in a certain region, while economic potential narrows that down to cost-effective systems. Market potential further refines this range by considering customer willingness to invest, and adoption at the last stage of this funnel is driven by economic viability and modeled with a diffusion function. Next slide, please. So this slide details what are the key input parameters that's needed by DGen model to perform their forecasting methodology. So there are parameters such as LiDAR scans for rooftop suitability, regional electricity consumption profiles, historic DER deployments, technology costs, and financing options. It can also incorporate solar and storage incentives, if there are any, policies and retail electricity rates tailored to each region or sector. Next slide, please. So about this last section, I will talk about this California Energy Commission study that Enel had done back in 2023 and reporting out in 2024. So this is an example of what we can look into for a statewide adoption methodology. Next slide, please. So there are a large set of data that was used for this particular case study. This next few slides, I am looking into these key data sets. So we started with geospatial resolution, which contains residential sector data, building types, single family or 10-year buildings. Commercial sector, we utilized US Department of Energy reference of 16 commercial building types. Next slide. So once we have an understanding of geospatial resolution, we can then look into more granular data sets such as building stock. So that gives us an understanding of how solar suitability levels vary from one building type to another. And these data sets that was used in this 2023 case study was updated based on the 2021 American Community Survey. So once we have these building stock data ready, then we move into this electrical loads section where NREL's tools such as RESTOC and COMSTOCK models were calibrated with the load data that was provided by CEC at the county level. For solar resources, TMOI3 profiles were used for 4,000 plus locations. Next slide, please. As far as retail rates go, this study used OpenEI utility rate database. Policies and incentives, we utilized state incentives for renewable and efficiency that's provided by this Desire website. And the technology cost was gotten from most recent annual technology base or ATP report. Next slide, please. So this slide shows some key outputs from this CEC case study. We can see that the forecasting suggests the PV would nearly double from 2023 to 2040. And storage capacities were modeled to see more than a 5-fold increase here. So some of the underlying factors which were driving these exponential growth were a decrease in payback period and increased savings that was seen by the consumers. Next slide, please. Finally, this slide looks into these cumulative solar and storage capacity with an anticipated plateauing happening around 2034. Interestingly, this was coming from the fact that the ITC expiration date was originally set around that time, around 2034. But recently that date has been accelerated, and now with the tax credit expiry happening around the end of 2025, we might see that this saturation effect that's happening for solar and storage capacity will probably expedite, and we'll see that sooner than later. Next slide, please. So keeping all of these adoption and forecasting methods in mind, here are some questions states can explore, very much along the same lines as Margaret's presentation. So the first question that the states can ask are, what solar forecasting tools are being used by utilities? In our experience, we've seen that this particular topic is very widely varied because each utility has their own ways of addressing solar forecasting methodology. So this is a good question to ask from the state's perspective and understand what the utilities are doing. The second thing is, what countermeasures do the utilities have in place to account for uncertainty and error margins in these forecasting models? Do they have available BESS resources that can fast response? Are there other resources which can take over when there are, let's say, a certain cloud-induced dip in the solar generation? What happens then? These type of fast-moving clouds and the dips that's happening due to those are usually difficult to forecast. So what are the countermeasures that they're thinking about to address these error margins? And lastly, the other good question to ask is, how are they keeping track of behind-the-meter assets? So behind-the-meter assets are typically not always recorded by their asset management system. But once you see the load profiles, you can see the presence of certain grid edge assets. So these are, again, good questions to explore to understand what are their methodology or what are their approach to this problem of looking into behind-the-meter storages and tracking those storages. And that doesn't have to be limited to solar and storage. It can be other grid edge assets as well. So these are some of the good questions that the states can explore in this forecasting topic. So with that, that's all from me, and I'll hand it back to you, Pete, for closing up.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Shibani, and thank you, Margaret. So just wanted to highlight the fact that this webinar series is actually part of a broader technical assistance program. If you could go back one slide, that is available to state energy offices and state regulatory agencies. The program provides 3 different types of technical assistance. One is a pretty simple help desk, we call it. It provides up to 4 person hours, conversation with Shibani or Margaret about some of the things maybe you heard today, or how it maybe interacts or connects with some of the forecasting activities that are going on in your state. We have a next level up that provides support of up to 100 person hours. Both of these activities can be accessed through a very simple intake form. The URL on the left-hand side, statetaprogram.lbl.gov, will give you access to it. There's a enroll here or apply here button there. You can also use the QR code on the left-hand side to access the same website. Last but not least, we have what we call as our deep dive. This is for technical assistance activities that typically will take 6 to 12 to 18 months. We are currently not offering that, but we certainly hope to do so with additional federal funding in the coming year. So please keep an eye out for that. And so with that, I want to thank you for listening in today on this webinar. Contact information for Shibani Ghosh, Margaret Pigman, and Sean Murphy are on the next slide. If you have any questions about the topics you heard today, you want to reach out and get some clarity around any of the things that were discussed today, please do consider reaching out to them directly. And so with that, thank you very much. Please do access any of the other webinars in this series. Have a great day.